Hello, I'm Karin Pfeiffer from Michigan State University. I'm presenting Promoting Physical Activity in Youth from Underrepresented Populations. We have much to learn. I feel like I always have to start by talking about the prevalence of physical inactivity in youth, but I'm really preaching to the choir, I would assume, in this group. Most of you know that people are not meeting physical activity recommendations, and less than 50% of children and adolescents are doing so. Of course, this prevalence declines with age. And the piece that is of most interest for what I'm talking about today is the fact that people who come from underrepresented populations have lower prevalence of meeting physical activity guidelines. Naturally, we want to create interventions in order to address this. This is all set in the backdrop of the fact that children in schools generally are a fairly captive audience in order for us to accomplish this. Some of you out there have done some intervention work, and I'm preaching to the choir here as well if I'm telling you this, but others aren't as familiar with intervention work. And truly, it's a labor of love when you conduct this kind of research. In order to do things correctly, you need to dot the I's, cross the T's over and over and over again from a standpoint of you must create a formative assessment plan. You need to talk to your population, figure out their interests, figure out their needs. You need to devise your intervention. You need to pilot test over and over and over again. And really, you have to attend to the fact that there are efficacy trials when you try to conduct this work under the best possible circumstances versus the effectiveness trials when you then try to move it out and generalize it to other populations. Evaluation, of course, needs to be part of this, and you have your typical outcome evaluation, but then you also have your process evaluation or intervention evaluation, where you're thinking about the reach, the dose delivered and received, fidelity, those sorts of characteristics. So a lot of things to think about. And frankly, if you're going to do all this the right way, it's very time intensive, but also funding intensive for sure. And so this is not really for the lighthearted in the whole first place. You have to be willing to put in extra work. And naturally, I'm not saying, people in other fields don't put in the same kind of work, because I know everyone does. But it's just kind of a special niche, I think. And you ask yourself the question then, well, have our physical activity interventions in youth really worked? And I have 4 studies I'll just briefly mention here. Esther Van Sluis found some evidence for physical activity interventions in youth working. Susie Kreemler and colleagues suggested that 47 to 65% of trials were effective, and that school-based multi-component interventions seemed to work the best. Metcalf and colleagues suggested that these sorts of interventions have a small effect, which they translated to 4 minutes or more of walking or running a day. And most recently, Jones and colleagues talked about a pooled effect size of about 0.57, and that these interventions tended to have a moderate effect during the actual intervention time, but not really replicated across the entire day. Are we overwhelmed with the results of these? Maybe, right? However, one piece that I don't think has been well addressed or considered is how many of these studies have addressed underrepresented populations? It's a great question. I don't think we really know the answer. And all 4 of those studies that I mentioned, those reviews on the previous slide, the authors did not indicate SES or race, ethnicity even being captured as part of their variables of interest. And there are not too many review papers out there that address these type of populations. And I'm talking very specifically, of course, in children and adolescents. I've been fortunate over time to have been involved with some studies that involve interventions in children and adolescents. And my first experiences were with Russ Pate's group at the University of South Carolina. And I was very lucky to be involved with this large scale trial, multi-site, 40 some $1 million from NIH. And we certainly had a nationally representative population, and we addressed people from underrepresented populations for sure, especially at our South Carolina site, at the Tulane, and at the Maryland sites. However, the study was not really tailored toward those populations. Now, Russ's group, of course, has done some work. For example, their active winners study was really targeted toward those populations. But we had another study when I was there that was a preschool intervention study. And again, in that study, while we included that population, I'm not sure that we were very specifically targeting that population. Now, since then, I've had a little bit of opportunity to work on some tailored studies for that population. And my colleague Lorraine Robbins and I have done some work with Girls on the Move. We had an R21 and then an R01. This is middle school girls, grades 5 through 8 essentially. And we very intentionally included as almost half African American, and at least 50% of people included in the study receive free or reduced price lunch at school, to try and really address socioeconomic and racial ethnic minority differences. And in that study, you know, we had pilot work that we did, then we had our R21, which was pilot work even further, and then we had our R01, and yet somehow we still managed to keep learning through the entire study things that we did not know before about our population of interest. And one of the examples was when we got to the large scale trial and we were conducting our physical activity after school club, we learned that some of the girls were not attending because of fights with the other girls and what they called drama. And we didn't experience that in all of our pilot studies. And it was a very different element. Another barrier that arose was the fact that on a dime, all of a sudden someone couldn't attend our physical activity club because they had to go home and take care of younger siblings. Or they might not have known where they were going to sleep that night and they needed to go sort out affairs. I've also done some work in Flint, Michigan, and the Crim Fitness Foundation is there, one of my partners. They've been doing a lot of programming and I would help them evaluate that programming. Those were elementary school boys and girls. And again, you know, the programs at least were devised and created for that very specific environment. We were in the Flint Public Schools. And incidentally, I was doing this work both before and after the lead crisis was known. And again, we had unique sets of circumstances here and things that remind you that you're in a different environment. And one day we were measuring on a Monday, taking some heights and weights, and a boy said to us how excited he was to go to lunch that day. And we were asking him why. And he said, well, I haven't eaten since Friday. I didn't get food over the weekend, and I'm really excited to go have some food at lunch today. And it just puts our research studies and what we're doing into some perspective. And those are things that happen that you need to think about and need to address, but you don't always know until you happen and learn. And so there are just many lessons to learn when working with these populations. I have to say that my very favorite study I did was really more like a pilot or feasibility type of study. And it included students in Flint. We had this pilot where we were doing nature-based physical activities. And we included a little bit of youth development elements in this study as well. And you can see from the slide, we had a high percentage of African-American students and several receiving free and reduced price lunch who participated, and that was our goal. And we had a fabulous PE teacher from this school, so only 26 children. And this paper is published in a book that is some conference proceedings, and it's not my most highly cited piece of work, but it's still my favorite. And Did we have any effects on the outcome measures, physical activity, fitness, and these psychosocial characteristics? No, we didn't, but the program really was only 5 weeks, and it was the best we could do at the time for what was happening. And there were elements delivered in school and after school, and the after school elements were not as easily delivered, but we were trying to expose children to hiking activities and biking activities. We did fishing in the gym. So obviously not with real fish, but uh, at the end of the day, although we didn't really see outcome measures change in that time frame, what we did see was students reporting overwhelming satisfaction with the program. They loved this activity called the camouflage hike that we did, and there was an outdoor camp that they loved. And they actually did get to fish at the outdoor camp. They mountain biked, they did high ropes courses, they did zip lines, and they noted that they learned to face their fears and try new things. And that, to me, is what it's all about. And to be able to witness seeing something change in these children is a bigger, more important thing to me than if we were really able to change everything that we set out to change. And I think that when we're considering working with populations from underrepresented groups, we have a lot of issues to consider. One of those is our theoretical frameworks. My question is, do our theoretical frameworks really apply to these populations? Consider all the work that's been done to develop these theories. Has that really been done on these populations? And do we know that those variables are really salient for these types of populations? What about the measurement tools? Where do we get our psychometric properties for all of the measurement tools that we're using? Typically, I would say it's the white middle-class suburban population surrounding the university. They are a convenience sample, and we figure that these instruments should work in these populations like they work in others, but do we really know that? And are the variables that we're capturing salient? Is the wording we're using correctly understood? I don't know. And this one-size-fits-all approach, does that really work? Is that something for which we should strive? Or is there a better way to conceptualize how to work in some of these populations that just have different things to consider than what we might be used to? And frankly, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say that most of us probably don't understand these settings due to our own privilege. And that's no fault of ours either. This is the place that we come from, but I think we are in a new era of trying to recognize that we come from these places of privilege, and we need to learn about others' perspectives and what is happening. And so while that's not wrong, we need to do better. We need to think better. We need to talk to populations, and we really need to figure out what are the most important variables. So with this TED Talk, my whole goal is to give you a call to action and to say that we really need to thoughtfully and purposefully include underrepresented populations while we're developing behavioral theories, while we are assessing the tools and surveys and instruments that we have. We need to very carefully consider the best way to include these populations and to do it right. Most of the time in these populations, it's about relationships, and we need to develop these relationships. It's important. And we really need to walk the walk, truly learn the landscape, take the time to get in, work in these populations, really know what's happening, and think about what's best. What is really going to get these populations moving when that might not be their primary concern, nor should it be a lot of the time. So what kind of things can we really do to have an impact? I think those are the sorts of things that we need to consider moving forward. And I'm hoping that by pointing out some of these things today, that others think about this too, and that we can come together and think about more meaningful ways to involve underrepresented populations in our work. I'd just like to briefly acknowledge some of the funding sources and teams at both the University of South Carolina and Michigan State who've been involved in a lot of this painstaking work over time. Thanks so much to them and to you for your attention.